Hello and welcome back. So far, 137 countries have abolished the death penalty. Despite this, according to Amnesty International last year, over 1,200 people were executed in 24 countries. Well, China uses the death penalty more than any other nation. In 2007, it executed at least 50% more people than Iran. Well, that country holds the second highest number of executions. However, there is evidence that capital punishment is losing its popularity. Pakistan is another of the most prolific users of the death penalty. In April, a bill was ratified to ban it in the country. It's currently waiting for President Musharraf's signature before it can become law, though. And as for whether the presence of the death penalty is a deterrent, well, in the US, a 2006 FBI report showed that the highest murder rate was in the South. The South also accounts for 80% of the country's executions. In sharp contrast, the Northeast carries out fewer than 1% of the nation's executions. Yet it has the lowest murder rate. Well, joining us again, our guests in Houston, Texas, Dudley Sharp, in Amsterdam, Andrew Cayley, and in Doha, Najib and Noaimi. If I could actually start with Dudley in the United States, just looking at some of those figures there, I know you are an advocate for victims' rights. Is the death penalty a deterrent? Do we forget about the rights of the victims, the innocent victims who were murdered, and focus too much on the rights of their killers?
Generally speaking, yes. Jennifer and Elizabeth were two lovely, wonderful girls, aged 14 and 16, in Houston, Texas, with a wonderful life and a wonderful life before them. And the executed murderer in this case, Medellín, raped them every way possible, tortured them, and then murdered them along with his compatriots. And yes, we do concentrate way too much on the murderers in these cases. Regarding deterrence, first of all, it's not measured by using murder rates versus executions. The new science regarding deterrence, number one, there's not any prospect for a negative consequence that doesn't deter someone. That's a rule without an exception. In the United States, for example, there's been 16 recent studies, inclusive of the defenses of their studies, which have found for death penalty deterrence. And that really shouldn't surprise anyone because, generally speaking, people fear death a lot more than they do life. And in the United States, the options are life without parole and the death penalty in capital cases. And so it really isn't surprising that it does act as a deterrent.
All right, Najib and Noaimi, while perhaps advocates of the death sentence in the US look at it as a deterrent towards murder, some might argue that from Medellín to Guantanamo Bay, the lesson is that it depends on your nationality, perhaps even whether you're a part of an ethnic minority, as to what type of justice system you get in the United States, especially if you're on death row.
Well, you have to understand that after the 11th September, over 23,000 approximately, that's a little figure, were detained without a right for a trial, without the right to have a consulate on the side. Arabs and some foreign consulars were searching for their students around different places around the U.S. Who been only discovered after 1 month or 20 days that they were found actually being detained somewhere. And some of my clients were detained in a toilet with 3 people for about 3 days without giving them the right to see a consulate or even to have somebody to chat why you have been detained us on this toilet for 3 days. So misjustice and denial of rights for foreigner is a practice we have seen it, in the U.S., especially after the 9th September. We cannot say, the security of the U.S. have to be overcome what rights that individual people have to have. I mean, in Guantanamo, for example, the big hole that the people being, placed there are now the legal system. The military legal system, we can call it, is losing the grip of would they continue to the trial or not, especially after the Supreme Court have really requested that they have to be tried before on the U.S. as well. So the whole system is collapsing towards, the denial of the rights of the foreign individuals being detained within the jurisdictions of the U.S.
Right. Andrew, looking at some of the issues which Najib has raised there, is it a matter of perhaps a lack of training for local law enforcement, police in the U.S. who are not used to dealing with foreigners, or is it perhaps a deliberate policy to deal with foreigners differently than U.S. nationals when it comes to giving them rights?
I don't think so. I think probably the simple answer to that question is that it's basically a lack of local knowledge. The reason that Mr. Medellín didn't get his consular representation was, as Mr. Sharp pointed out, because they didn't know that he was a Mexican, and probably because the local law enforcement agencies didn't know that even if he was a Mexican, a foreign national, that he was actually entitled to consular advice.
Well, when it comes to other categories of people being held, those being held in Guantanamo Bay, those, I believe, a Qatari national being held who is a U.S. resident, and the U.S. authorities are trying to deprive him of some of the constitutional rights that are usually afforded, at least to U.S. nationals. Can that be blamed on a lack of training? Surely those are much higher decisions, taking at much higher levels.
No, in that instance, I think the United States has taken a deliberate decision to move individuals outside the jurisdiction of the United States courts in order to deprive people of their legal rights. Yes, I think that's true.
Andrew, let's go over to Dudley. And how do you feel about that? It's often said outside of the U.S. that foreigners and even members of ethnic minorities within the United States, members of lower social and economic classes, don't get the same justice system as the rich upper class.
Let me just give you an example from the subject José Medellín case. He has had 15 years of due process in one of the most brutal murder cases we've ever had in Texas. He's been through the state system. He's been through the federal system. He is presumed innocent until proven guilty in our system. He's read the Miranda rights. He's entitled to an attorney. And he's had one for 15 years. We never denied him access to consular assistants or consular attorneys. I agree with Andrew 100%. The local law enforcement throughout the United States, I'm not sure any of them had ever heard of the Vienna Convention. That's the responsibility, I suspect, of the U.S. State Department. And even had they known that he was a Mexican national, which he didn't, I mean, it's Mr. Medellín's obligation to tell the detaining officers, if he thinks it's meaningful, that he is a Mexican national. But since he had spent virtually his entire life in Texas, they didn't ask and he didn't tell them. It's important, particularly in Texas. The dominant population in Texas is now Hispanic in this state. And there's no evidence, at least in Texas, and with the death penalty in general. As a matter of fact, in the United States, white murderers are twice as likely to be executed in the United States as black murderers are, for example. There's no evidence that
if that's the
within
case,
the
Dudley,
imposition
why
of the
do we
death
always
penalty,
hear that there are more African Americans and Hispanics on death row than white people? Is that an exaggerated or taken out of context?
Well, no. If you put blacks and Hispanics together, I suspect there are more on death row than there are whites. What I just said was white murderers are twice as likely to be executed, which is in fact true. If the majority of the people committing capital crimes in the United States, well, actually, if you combine Hispanics and blacks together, they do commit more capital murders in the United States than whites. Remember, capital murder is a totally unique kind of murder in the United States. It's not a regular murder. It's a special type of murder.
Right.
And there's no evidence that we're being prejudiced in any way against minorities in this country with regard to the imposition of the death penalty, if you look at the percentages of people committing capital murder.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we are running out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Dudley Sharp, victims' rights advocate. Andrew Cayley, former senior trial attorney at the ICC. And Najib al-Nuaimi, lawyer of the former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein and former Qatari Justice Minister. Thank you all for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you for viewing this episode. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Feel free to email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.